Eleanor Sullivan collapsed to her knees on the weathered porch, her arthritis forgotten as three massive shadows emerged from the Appalachian tree line. The coffee mug slipped from her trembling fingers, shattering against the wooden boards. These weren't the cubs she had bottle-fed 7 years ago. They were full-grown red wolves, each weighing nearly 90 pounds, their golden eyes fixed on her with impossible recognition. Marcus Rodriguez's radio crackled to life in his patrol car, his voice breaking as he whispered into the receiver, "We've got a situation at the Sullivan property. Send backup, but tell them to approach carefully." The forest had gone completely silent, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Eleanor's weathered hands reached toward the lead wolf, remembering the tiny heartbeat she had felt against her palm when she first found him dying beneath that overturned truck. The same wolf now bore fresh scars across his muzzle, blood still matting his dark fur. "Alpha," she whispered, her voice cracking with 7 years of grief. "My God, what have they done to you?" What had brought her children home after all these years? And why did they look like they had just escaped from hell? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Eleanor May Sullivan had never expected to spend her 72nd birthday alone, but life had a way of rewriting even the most carefully laid plans. The retired wildlife biologist sat in her creaking rocking chair on the wraparound porch of her late husband's family cabin, nestled deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains of West Virginia. 15 acres of pristine wilderness stretched around her like a protective embrace, the nearest neighbor a comfortable 3 miles down the winding mountain road. The morning mist clung to the valley below, and Eleanor pulled her worn cardigan tighter against the September chill. 5 years had passed since Robert's funeral, 5 years since lung cancer had stolen her partner of 43 years. The silence that had once been filled with his gentle humming as he tended his workshop now pressed against her like a physical weight. Their daughter Sarah called dutifully every Sunday from her environmental law practice in California, but the conversations had grown stilted since their last argument about Eleanor moving to assisted living. "You can't stay out there alone forever, Mom," Sarah had pleaded during their most recent call. "What if something happens? What if you fall or get sick or—" "This is my home," Eleanor had interrupted, her voice carrying the same stubborn edge that had gotten her through 4 decades of fieldwork studying endangered species. "Your father and I built our life here. I'm not abandoning it now." The truth was more complicated than Eleanor cared to admit. At 72, she felt every one of her years in her arthritic joints and the way her breath caught when climbing the porch steps. But this property held more than memories. It held purpose. Every morning, she fed the cardinals and blue jays that had learned to trust her gentle presence. Every evening, she documented wildlife sightings in the leather journal Robert had given her for their 20th anniversary. Dr. Patricia Hawkins, her veterinarian friend from their college days at West Virginia University, stopped by twice a month with groceries and companionship. Marcus Rodriguez, the park ranger assigned to their district, checked on her monthly as well, though Eleanor suspected his visits were more about kindness than official duty. At 48, Marcus reminded her of the graduate students she had once mentored. Earnest, dedicated, and blessed with the patience to listen to an old woman's stories about the days when wildlife conservation was still a radical idea. Eleanor's career had been built on studying creatures that existed on the knife's edge of extinction. She had spent summers tracking black bears through these very mountains, had published papers on the delicate ecosystem balance that most people never bothered to understand. Retirement had been forced upon her not by age, but by budget cuts that eliminated her position at the State Wildlife Agency. Now her only companions were the creatures that visited her feeders and the memories that filled every corner of the cabin. As she sipped her morning coffee and watched a red-tailed hawk circle overhead, Eleanor had no idea that her quiet, predictable life was about to be shattered by 4 tiny heartbeats that would change everything she thought she knew about love, loss, and the unbreakable bonds between species. The morning that would change Eleanor's life forever began like any other. She had risen at dawn, as was her habit, and stepped onto the porch with her steaming cup of coffee to watch the forest wake up. But something felt different today. An unusual stillness hung over the woods, as if the very air was holding its breath. No birds sang from their usual perches, no squirrels chattered in the oak trees. Even the ever-present hum of insects had fallen silent. Concerned by the eerie quiet, Eleanor decided to take her morning walk earlier than usual. She pulled on her worn hiking boots and grabbed her walking stick, following the familiar deer trail that wound through the dense undergrowth behind her cabin. The path had been carved by generations of white-tailed deer seeking water from the creek that ran along her property's eastern boundary. Robert had walked this same trail with her countless times, pointing out animal tracks and identifying bird calls with the enthusiasm of a man who never tired of nature's small miracles. 20 minutes into her walk, Eleanor noticed the acrid smell of motor oil and burnt rubber hanging heavy in the morning air. The scent was completely foreign to these pristine woods, and it grew stronger as she followed a bend in the trail. Through a gap in the trees, she spotted something that made her heart skip a beat. The twisted metal remains of a pickup truck wrapped around the massive trunk of an ancient oak tree. The vehicle had clearly been there for several days. Rust-colored stains marked the bark where the truck had struck, and broken glass sparkled like deadly diamonds in the morning sunlight. The driver's door hung open at an unnatural angle, and Eleanor could see that the cab was empty. She approached cautiously, her trained eye taking in the details that told a grim story. Skid marks in the soft earth suggested the driver had tried desperately to stop or swerve. The impact had been violent enough to deploy the airbags, which now hung deflated like pale, wrinkled skin, but it was what she found scattered around the crash site that truly broke her heart. Makeshift wooden crates had been thrown from the truck bed during the impact, their contents spilled across the forest floor. Eleanor recognized the crude construction immediately. These were the kind of containers used by illegal wildlife traders, designed to transport animals in the most inhumane conditions possible. Her stomach churned as she counted at least 6 shattered crates, their wire mesh doors twisted and broken. The driver's body lay 20 feet from the truck, partially hidden beneath a fallen branch. Eleanor had seen enough death in her years of field work to know there was nothing she could do for him. But as she turned away from the grim scene, a faint whimpering sound caught her attention. It was so soft she almost missed it, nearly lost beneath the gentle rustle of leaves in the morning breeze. Following the sound, Eleanor pushed through a tangle of wild rhododendron bushes and found herself staring at a sight that would haunt her dreams for years to come. 4 tiny wolf cubs, no more than 3 or 4 weeks old, huddled together in a shallow depression beneath the overturned truck's engine block. Their eyes had recently opened, revealing the distinctive amber color that marked them as red wolves, a species that hadn't been seen in these mountains for over 50 years. The cubs were in desperate condition. Their ribs showed clearly through their thin fur, and their tiny bodies trembled with weakness and dehydration. One of the cubs, slightly larger than the others, lifted his head at Eleanor's approach and let out a pitiful whine that cut straight through her heart. She could see that without immediate intervention, all 4 would be dead within hours. Eleanor's mind raced as she knelt beside the cubs. Red wolves were among the most endangered species in North America, with fewer than 300 individuals remaining in existence. These cubs represented not just 4 small lives, but a genetic treasure that was literally priceless. She knew that possessing them without proper federal permits was a serious crime that could result in years in prison. But she also knew that by the time she could navigate the bureaucratic maze of wildlife agencies and emergency protocols, these babies would be nothing but tiny corpses. Near the cubs, Eleanor discovered the body of their mother, a magnificent female red wolf who had clearly been shot before the crash. The bullet wound in her chest told a story of cruelty that made Eleanor's hands clench into fists. The illegal trader had probably planned to sell the cubs to private collectors or roadside zoos, but the mother had fought to protect her young, earning a fatal bullet for her maternal instincts. Gently, Eleanor gathered the cubs into her jacket, feeling their fragile heartbeats against her chest. The largest cub, whom she immediately began thinking of as Alpha, had distinctive markings around his eyes that gave him an almost regal appearance. The smallest, a female with silver-tipped fur that caught the morning light, seemed the most alert despite her weakened condition. Eleanor decided to call her Luna. The third cub, another male, had curious, intelligent eyes that darted constantly around his surroundings, earning him the name Scout. The fourth, a female who pressed closest to Eleanor's warmth, would become Spirit. The walk back to her cabin felt like the longest of Eleanor's life. Each step jarred the precious cargo in her arms, and she found herself whispering soothing words to the cubs as she navigated the familiar trail. "It's going to be okay, babies," she murmured, though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. "I'm going to take care of you." Once inside her cabin, Eleanor's scientific training took over. She quickly converted her spare bedroom into a makeshift nursery, using old blankets to create a warm, secure nest for the cubs. Her first call was to Dr. Patricia Hawkins, who arrived within an hour with supplies and a sworn promise to keep Eleanor's secret. Together, they examined each cub, documenting their condition and creating a feeding schedule that would give them the best chance of survival. "Eleanor, you know what you're risking," Patricia said quietly as they watched the cubs take their first tentative sips from improvised bottles. "If the federal wildlife officers find out about this, then we make sure they don't find out," Eleanor replied, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. "At least not until these babies are strong enough to survive whatever bureaucratic nightmare awaits them." That first night, Eleanor didn't sleep. She sat beside the cubs' makeshift den, feeding them every 2 hours and monitoring their breathing. As dawn broke over the mountains, all 4 cubs were still alive, and for the first time since Robert's death, Eleanor felt a purpose that filled the empty spaces in her heart. The transformation that occurred over the following months defied everything Eleanor thought she knew about wolves and their capacity for human bonding. What began as a desperate rescue mission evolved into something far more profound, a relationship that challenged the very boundaries between species and forced Eleanor to confront uncomfortable truths about federal wildlife laws she had once helped write. By their second month, the cubs had tripled in size and developed distinct personalities that both delighted and concerned Eleanor. Alpha had grown into his name, displaying natural leadership qualities that were remarkable in such a young animal. He was the first to investigate new sounds, the first to taste new foods, and instinctively positioned himself between his littermates and any perceived threat. Luna's intelligence manifested in problem-solving abilities that often left Eleanor speechless. She learned to open simple latches, figured out how to tip over water bowls to create small pools for cooling off, and seemed to understand human facial expressions with uncanny accuracy. Scout lived up to his adventurous nature, constantly testing the boundaries of their outdoor enclosure that Eleanor had constructed behind the cabin. His curiosity was both endearing and exhausting, as he discovered weak points in fencing that Eleanor didn't even know existed. Spirit, true to her name, remained Eleanor's shadow, following her from room to room and whimpering whenever separated for more than a few minutes. She slept curled against Eleanor's bedroom door each night as if standing guard over her human mother. The development of their communication system began organically. Eleanor found herself naturally adjusting her vocal patterns when speaking to the cubs, using higher-pitched tones that seemed to calm them. More remarkably, she began developing a unique whistle sequence, 3 short bursts followed by 2 longer ones, that served as a universal come-home signal. The cubs learned to respond to this whistle from impressive distances, often returning at a dead run when they heard Eleanor's call echo through the mountains. But it was the cubs' response to their individual names that truly amazed Eleanor's scientific mind. Within 3 months, each cub could distinguish not only their own name, but the names of their siblings. Alpha would look directly at Luna when Eleanor said her name, and Scout would gently nudge Spirit when called. This level of linguistic comprehension was far beyond what wildlife behavioral studies suggested was possible. The challenges of keeping 4 growing wolves secret became increasingly complex as summer progressed into fall. The cubs, now weighing nearly 40 pounds each, required substantial amounts of meat. Dr. Hawkins helped by connecting Eleanor with local hunters who provided venison, but the logistics of feeding 4 apex predators was straining Eleanor's modest retirement budget. More concerning was their growing strength and confidence. What had once been playful puppy nips now carried real force, and their natural instincts to establish territory and hierarchy were beginning to surface. Eleanor's property boundaries, which had once seemed adequate for her solitary lifestyle, now felt claustrophobic. The cubs needed space to run, to hunt, to behave like the wild animals they were genetically programmed to be. She reinforced her existing fence line and added an additional acre of enclosed space, but she could see the longing in their eyes when they gazed toward the vast wilderness beyond their artificial boundaries. The first real warning came from Tom Peterson, her nearest neighbor, during his monthly check-in visit. Tom was a retired coal miner who had moved to the mountains for the peace and quiet, and his property offered a clear view of Eleanor's backyard enclosure. "Eleanor, I've been seeing some mighty large dogs running around your place," he mentioned casually during a conversation about the upcoming winter weather. "Hope you're being careful. They look big enough to cause some real trouble if they got loose." Eleanor's carefully practiced response about adopting some rescue dogs from the shelter seemed to satisfy Tom's curiosity, but she knew that her secret was becoming harder to maintain. The cubs' howling, which had started as barely audible whimpers, was developing into the full-throated song that could carry for miles through the mountain valleys. Worse, they were beginning to respond to the howls of wild coyotes that roamed the surrounding forests, creating an eerie nighttime chorus that would certainly attract attention. Dr. Hawkins brought more troubling news during her October visit. "Eleanor, I've been hearing talk at the veterinary conference about increased wildlife enforcement in this region. Someone filed a report about unusual animal activity in the mountains. They're specifically looking for evidence of illegal exotic animal possession." Patricia's usually steady hands trembled slightly as she examined Scout's latest growth measurements. "The cubs are approaching 50 pounds each. They're not going to pass for domestic dogs much longer." The reality of Eleanor's situation crystallized on a crisp November morning when she discovered Luna had figured out how to unlatch not 1 but 3 separate gate mechanisms during the night. Eleanor found muddy paw prints leading from the enclosure across her property and disappearing into the dense forest beyond. For 6 terrifying hours she searched the woods, calling Luna's name and playing her special whistle until her lips were numb from the cold mountain air. Luna returned on her own just before sunset, emerging from the tree line with something that made Eleanor's blood run cold: fresh rabbit fur clinging to her muzzle and the satisfied expression of a successful hunter. The young wolf had spent the day doing exactly what 50 million years of evolution had programmed her to do, and she had done it well. This wasn't a domesticated animal playing in the woods. This was an apex predator awakening to her true nature. Now, that evening, Eleanor made the phone call she had been dreading for months. Sarah answered on the second ring, her voice bright with the assumption that her mother was calling for their usual Sunday conversation a day early. "Mom, how are you? I was just thinking about—" "Sarah, I need legal advice." Eleanor's interruption stopped her daughter mid-sentence. "I'm in trouble. Federal trouble." The conversation that followed was perhaps the most difficult of Eleanor's life. Sarah's initial disbelief gave way to professional concern as Eleanor explained the Cubs' origin story and their current situation. As an environmental lawyer, Sarah understood both the conservation value of what her mother had accomplished and the serious legal jeopardy she faced. "Mom, you could be looking at 5 years in federal prison," Sarah said, her voice tight with controlled panic. "The Endangered Species Act doesn't make exceptions for good intentions. And if these wolves have hurt anyone, or if they escape and cause property damage, they're not monsters, Sarah. They're remarkable, intelligent animals who have been given a second chance at life. That's not how a federal prosecutor will see it. You've been harboring federally protected wildlife without permits for 8 months. That's a felony, Mom. Multiple felonies." Eleanor stared out her kitchen window at the cubs playing in their enclosure. Alpha was teaching Spirit a hunting technique, demonstrating how to stalk and pounce on a fallen branch. Luna sat apart, grooming Scout with the gentle precision of an experienced mother. They looked like a family. Her family. "What are my options?" Eleanor asked quietly. Sarah's sigh carried clearly across the 3,000 miles between them. "You have to surrender them, Mom. Contact the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and arrange for their relocation to an approved facility. If you're proactive about it, if you emphasize the conservation value and provide all your documentation, you might avoid criminal charges. And if I don't, then you're gambling with your freedom and their lives. Because when, not if, but when, the authorities discover them, the cubs will likely be euthanized as problem animals, and you'll be prosecuted to the full extent of the law." Eleanor hung up the phone and walked outside to sit with her cubs one last time before making the most heartbreaking decision of her life. Alpha immediately approached, resting his massive head on her lap with the trust of a creature who had never known betrayal. Luna curled up beside her while Scout and Spirit wrestled playfully nearby. "I'm sorry, my babies," Eleanor whispered into Alpha's thick fur. "I'm so sorry." The decision to surrender the cubs initiated a period of research and preparation that felt like planning her own children's funeral. Eleanor threw herself into finding the best possible sanctuary, spending sleepless nights studying facility reports, conservation programs, and breeding protocols. The Red Wolf Recovery Program operated several locations across the southeastern United States. But Eleanor wanted more than just compliance with federal regulations. She wanted a place where Alpha, Luna, Scout, and Spirit would have the best possible chance at a meaningful life. The Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge in North Carolina emerged as the clear choice. Established in 1984 as the primary site for red wolf reintroduction efforts, the facility offered 152,000 acres of protected habitat where the cubs could experience something approaching wild freedom while still receiving necessary human oversight. Dr. Thomas Whitfield, the program's director, responded to Eleanor's initial inquiry with surprising enthusiasm. "Mrs. Sullivan, what you've accomplished is extraordinary," Dr. Whitfield told her during their first phone conversation. "Hand-raised red wolves typically don't develop proper social behaviors, but from your documentation, these cubs seem remarkably well adjusted. Your behavioral notes could provide invaluable insights into their cognitive development and social learning patterns." Eleanor had indeed been documenting everything. Her scientific training had compelled her to maintain detailed records of the cubs' growth, behavioral milestones, dietary preferences, and social interactions. She had filled 3 leather-bound journals with observations that would have taken professional researchers years to accumulate under controlled conditions. The cub's unusual upbringing, raised by a human but allowed to develop natural pack dynamics, represented a unique data set that could inform conservation efforts for decades to come. The preparation for surrender became an all-consuming project that helped Eleanor avoid confronting the emotional reality of what she was about to do. She worked with Dr. Hawkins to ensure all medical records were complete and current. Blood samples were drawn for genetic analysis, providing valuable data about the cub's lineage and genetic diversity. Each cub received microchip identification and a full veterinary examination that documented their excellent health and development. More challenging was the psychological preparation. Eleanor began gradually adjusting the cubs' routine to prepare them for life without constant human contact. She reduced the frequency of her direct interactions, encouraging them to rely more heavily on each other for comfort and companionship. The process was agonizing. Spirits confused, whimpering when Eleanor didn't respond to her attempts at play, felt like tiny knife wounds to Eleanor's heart. Sarah arrived from California 2 weeks before the scheduled transfer, ostensibly to provide moral support, but clearly also to ensure her mother followed through with the surrender. The reunion between mother and daughter was complicated by years of geographical distance and the current crisis, but Sarah's presence brought an unexpected comfort. Watching her daughter observe the cub's behavior provided Eleanor with a fresh perspective on what she had accomplished. "Mom, they're incredible," Sarah admitted on her 3rd day at the cabin, after initially viewing the situation through purely legal and practical lenses. She was sitting on the porch watching Alpha lead his siblings through what appeared to be a coordinated hunting exercise, using a fallen log as their prey. "I mean, I understand intellectually that they're wild animals, but the way they interact with you, it's like they understand they're part of your family." "They are part of my family," Eleanor replied quietly. "That's what makes this so impossible." Sarah's legal expertise proved invaluable in negotiating the terms of the surrender. Working directly with federal wildlife officials, she crafted an agreement that emphasized Eleanor's conservation intentions and the scientific value of her documentation. In exchange for full cooperation and the transfer of all behavioral records, Eleanor would avoid criminal prosecution. The agreement also included provisions for monthly visitation rights, an unprecedented concession that reflected the unique nature of the case. The sanctuary visit in early December felt like attending a funeral for people who were still alive. Eleanor and Dr. Hawkins made the 8-hour drive to North Carolina on a gray winter morning that matched Eleanor's mood perfectly. The Alligator River facility exceeded Eleanor's expectations. The cubs would have access to vast areas of swampland, forest, and coastal habitat that closely resembled their ancestral territory. Dr. Whitfield proved to be a kindred spirit, a fellow wildlife biologist whose passion for red wolf conservation was evident in every aspect of the facility's operation. He spent hours reviewing Eleanor's behavioral documentation, asking detailed questions about the cub's development that demonstrated genuine scientific curiosity rather than bureaucratic box-checking. "Mrs. Sullivan, I want you to understand that your cubs won't be confined to small enclosures," Dr. Whitfield explained as they toured the facility. "Our breeding program operates more like a managed wilderness than a traditional zoo. The wolves have access to hundreds of acres at a time, and they hunt, mate, and raise families according to their natural instincts." The facility's success stories were encouraging. Several packs had been successfully reintroduced to the wild, and the genetic diversity that Eleanor's cubs would contribute could help stabilize the entire species' future. But knowing that her cubs would serve a greater purpose didn't make the impending separation any easier to bear. Eleanor's final week with the Cubs passed in a haze of bittersweet moments that she tried desperately to memorize. She took hundreds of photographs, captured video of their play sessions, and recorded the unique vocalizations each Cub used to communicate with her. Alpha's greeting rumble when she appeared each morning, Luna's problem-solving victories, Scout's fearless exploration of new territory, Spirit's gentle headbutts when seeking comfort, she wanted to preserve every detail of their personalities. The Cubs seemed to sense that something significant was approaching. Their behavior became more attention-seeking, with all four competing for Eleanor's proximity in ways they hadn't since their early weeks. Spirit began following Eleanor so closely that she frequently bumped into the wolf when she stopped walking. Alpha became protective to the point of aggression, growling at Dr. Hawkins during her final examination visit. Luna's usual confidence gave way to an unusual clinginess that broke Eleanor's heart. On their last night together, Eleanor abandoned all pretense of maintaining appropriate boundaries. She brought her sleeping bag outside and spent the night in the Cubs' enclosure, surrounded by 70 pounds of warm wolf body heat. And they arranged themselves around her like a living blanket. Alpha at her back, Spirit curled against her chest, Luna and Scout pressed against her sides. The familiar comfort of their presence, their gentle breathing and occasional sleep whimpers, created a cocoon of peace that Eleanor knew she would never experience again. The transport team arrived at dawn on December 15th, a date that would forever mark the end of Eleanor's most meaningful relationship since Robert's death. Dr. Whitfield had personally overseen the construction of specialized transport crates designed for the Cubs' size and temperament. Each crate was large enough to allow comfortable movement and was equipped with familiar bedding items that carried Eleanor's scent. The loading process proved even more traumatic than Eleanor had anticipated. Alpha, sensing the significance of the moment, refused to enter his crate despite Eleanor's encouraging words and the special whistle sequence that had always brought him running. For 45 minutes, the magnificent wolf simply sat in the center of the enclosure, staring at Eleanor with an expression that seemed to ask, "Why are you doing this to us?" Luna's scientific curiosity overcame her apprehension. She investigated her crate thoroughly before finally settling inside, but her eyes never left Eleanor's face. Scout approached the situation like an adventure, bounding into his crate with characteristic enthusiasm before realizing that this particular game had higher stakes than usual. His confused whining when the crate door closed cut through Eleanor like a physical blow. Spirit's resistance was the most heartbreaking. The young wolf pressed herself against Eleanor's legs and simply refused to move, despite gentle coaxing and offered treats. When the transport team finally had to physically lift her into the crate, her desperate howling echoed across the mountain valley like a sound from Eleanor's worst nightmares. The wolf's amber eyes, wide with fear and confusion, locked onto Eleanor's face through the crate's wire mesh with an intensity that spoke of absolute betrayal. As the transport truck disappeared down the mountain road, Eleanor collapsed onto her porch steps and wept with an intensity that surprised her. She had cried when Robert died, but this felt different, like a part of her soul had been physically removed. The silence that settled over her property was absolute, broken only by the winter wind through bare branches and the distant sound of the truck's engine fading into nothing. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of depression and regret. Eleanor barely ate, rarely left the cabin, and found herself unconsciously listening for the sounds that had filled her life for 8 months: pause on the porch steps, the splash of wolves drinking from their water trough, the gentle huffing sounds they made when content. Her morning routine felt hollow without 4 eager faces waiting for breakfast, and her evening walks became exercises in avoiding the empty enclosure that still smelled like her children. Sarah extended her visit, clearly concerned about her mother's emotional state. She helped Eleanor box up the cubs' toys, bedding, and feeding equipment, items that Eleanor couldn't bear to look at, but also couldn't bring herself to throw away. The cleanup process felt like erasing the most meaningful period of Eleanor's life, reducing 8 months of profound connection to a pile of cardboard boxes in the spare bedroom. Dr. Hawkins stopped by twice in the first week, ostensibly for social visits but clearly conducting welfare checks on her grieving friend. "Eleanor, you saved their lives," she reminded her during one particularly difficult afternoon. "Without your intervention, those cubs would have died in the woods. Now they have a chance to contribute to their species' survival. That matters." "I know it matters intellectually," Eleanor replied, staring out at the empty enclosure. "But it doesn't make the house feel any less empty. It doesn't make me miss them any less." The first monthly visitation to North Carolina became a lifeline that Eleanor counted down to with the desperation of a prisoner marking days until parole. Dr. Whitfield had been true to his word. The cubs were thriving in their new environment, growing larger and stronger than would have been possible in Eleanor's limited space. But seeing them through chain-link fencing, knowing she could observe but not touch, was a special kind of torture that left Eleanor emotionally raw for days after each visit. 7 years had passed since that devastating December morning when Eleanor watched her cubs disappear down the mountain road, but the ache in her chest had never fully healed. The monthly visits to North Carolina had sustained her through the darkest periods of grief, watching Alpha, Luna, Scout, and Spirit mature into magnificent adult wolves who still recognized her voice and responded to her special whistle. But in March of 2024, everything changed when Dr. Whitfield made the phone call that shattered Eleanor's carefully reconstructed world. "Eleanor, I'm afraid I have some very difficult news." Dr. Whitfield's voice carried a weight that made Eleanor's stomach clench with dread. "During last night's storm, several sections of our perimeter fencing were compromised by fallen trees. When our staff conducted the morning head count, we discovered that 3 of your wolves are missing." The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. Hurricane-force winds had swept through eastern North Carolina, and the combination of uprooted trees and flooding had created chaos throughout the sanctuary. In the aftermath, Alpha, Luna, and Spirit had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only paw prints in the mud that led toward the vast wilderness beyond the facility's boundaries. "What about Scout?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Whitfield's pause told her everything she needed to know before he spoke. "Scout passed away 2 winters ago, Eleanor. I'm sorry. I thought I had told you during your last visit. He developed a respiratory infection that progressed to pneumonia. We did everything we could, but his immune system couldn't fight it off." Eleanor dropped the phone and collapsed into her kitchen chair, overwhelmed by a grief she thought she had already processed. Scout, her curious and fearless explorer, had died alone in a sanctuary while she was living her quiet life 300 miles away. The guilt was crushing. Had he called for her in his final moments? Had he wondered why she never came to comfort him? The massive search effort that followed involved dozens of wildlife officers, tracking dogs, and aerial surveillance, but the 3 escaped wolves seemed to have vanished into the vast wilderness of eastern North Carolina like ghosts. For weeks, Eleanor barely slept, jumping at every phone ring with hope that turned to disappointment. Local news stations picked up the story, broadcasting warnings about dangerous predators loose in the countryside that made Eleanor sick with worry for her wolves' safety. Marcus Rodriguez found Eleanor on her porch one morning in late March, staring blankly at the mountains with the hollow expression of someone who had lost hope. As the park ranger assigned to her district, Marcus had become more than an official contact over the years. He was one of the few people who truly understood what the wolves had meant to Eleanor. "Any word?" Marcus asked gently, settling into the wooden chair beside her. Eleanor shook her head. It's been 3 weeks. They could be anywhere by now. They could be... She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice her worst fears about hunters, traffic, or territorial disputes with wild animals. Eleanor, I need to tell you something, Marcus said carefully. There have been reports. Livestock kills in Virginia that don't match typical coyote or bear patterns. Game cameras have captured images of large canines moving north through the Appalachians. The pattern suggests they're following a specific route. Eleanor's heart began to race. You think they're coming home? I think it's possible. Red wolves have incredible navigation abilities, and if any animals could make a 400-mile journey through unfamiliar territory, it would be wolves with their pack bonds and survival instincts. The possibility that her cubs might be trying to return to her gave Eleanor a purpose she hadn't felt in years. She began preparing for their potential arrival with the same methodical determination that had characterized her scientific career. She reinforced the old enclosure, stockpiled food supplies, and contacted Dr. Hawkins about emergency medical preparedness. But she also knew that their return would create an impossible situation. Harboring escaped federal wildlife would be an even more serious crime than her original rescue had been. As spring turned to summer, the reports grew more frequent and geographically closer. A farmer in southwestern Virginia reported seeing 3 large wolves crossing his pasture at dawn. Trail cameras in Shenandoah National Park captured blurry images of canines too large to be coyotes. Each sighting brought them closer to Eleanor's mountains, closer to home. But the wolves weren't the only ones tracking their progress. Jake Morrison had been following the escape story in local hunting forums and wildlife enforcement bulletins with growing obsession. At 38, Jake carried physical and emotional scars from a childhood encounter with an aggressive wolf-dog hybrid that had killed his younger brother during a family camping trip. The incident had shaped his entire worldview about predators and their place in civilized society. Jake's hatred of wolves went beyond rational concern into the realm of personal vendetta. He had built a reputation as a skilled hunting guide who specialized in predator control, helping ranchers and farmers eliminate threats to livestock and property. The news that 3 dangerous wolves were moving through Virginia wilderness triggered every trauma response he had spent 30 years developing. These aren't some Disney movie wolves, Jake told his hunting partners, Billy Ray Compton and Curtis Stevens, during a planning session at the local sporting goods store. These are apex predators that have already proven they can't be contained. When they reach populated areas, people are going to die. Jake's obsession with tracking the escaped wolves intensified as summer progressed. He spent his own money on trail cameras, GPS tracking equipment, and high-powered rifles that could take down large game at significant distances. His research led him to Eleanor's story, and he became convinced that the elderly woman's property would be the wolves' ultimate destination. She's the one who started this whole mess, Jake explained to his increasingly uncomfortable companions. If she hadn't illegally harbored those animals in the first place, they wouldn't exist to threaten innocent people now. Billy Ray and Curtis had initially been attracted to Jake's wolf hunting expedition by the promise of easy money and the thrill of tracking dangerous game. But as Jake's rhetoric became more extreme and his methods more questionable, both men began to have second thoughts about their involvement. Jake's plan to conduct surveillance on Eleanor's property and wait for the wolves to arrive struck them as potentially crossing legal lines they weren't comfortable crossing. Eleanor remained unaware of Jake's activities through the summer months, focused entirely on preparing for a reunion she wasn't even certain would happen. She spent her evenings on the porch, playing her special whistle sequence into the gathering darkness and listening for any response from the forest. Dr. Hawkins visited more frequently, concerned about Eleanor's emotional state and the legal implications of what might be coming. "Eleanor, if those wolves do come back, you have to contact the authorities immediately," Patricia urged during one of their conversations. "You can't risk another federal violation. At your age, a prison sentence could be a death sentence." "I know what I should do," Eleanor replied. "But Patricia, they're my children. If they've traveled 400 miles to come home to me, how can I betray that trust again?" The moral complexity of Eleanor's situation became even more complicated when Sarah called in late August with news that the Federal Wildlife Enforcement Division was taking the escape situation seriously. Agents had been dispatched to all locations where the missing wolves might reasonably appear, including Eleanor's property. Sarah's legal contacts had informed her that her mother was already under surveillance as a person of interest in the case. "Mom, they're watching you," Sarah said bluntly. "If those wolves show up, the agents will know within hours. And this time, there won't be any plea bargains or sympathetic prosecutors. You'll be looking at serious federal time." Eleanor understood the stakes, but understanding and accepting were two different things. She had lost Robert to cancer, lost her cubs to federal regulations, and lost Scout to disease and distance. The possibility of losing Alpha, Luna, and Spirit again, this time permanently, felt like more than her 79-year-old heart could bear. As September arrived and the mountain air began to carry the crisp promise of autumn, Eleanor's vigil intensified. She had been playing her whistle sequence every evening for 6 months, sending her call out into the wilderness with the desperate hope that somewhere in the vast Appalachian wilderness 3 wolves might hear her voice and remember the love that had raised them from helpless cubs to magnificent predators. The answer to her prayers would come on a night when she least expected it, in a form that would test every belief she held about loyalty, sacrifice, and the unbreakable bonds between species. The attack came on a humid August night when the mountain air hung thick with the promise of thunderstorms. Eleanor had been following her evening routine, sitting on the porch with her cup of chamomile tea and playing her whistle sequence into the darkness when the sound of approaching vehicles shattered the peaceful silence. 3 sets of headlights cut through the trees as pickup trucks wound up her gravel driveway, their engines growling with aggressive intent that made Eleanor's pulse quicken with instinctive alarm. Jake Morrison emerged from the lead truck with the purposeful stride of a man who had spent weeks planning this moment. His face, marked by old scars from his childhood encounter with the wolf-dog hybrid, was set in grim determination. Behind him, Billy Ray Compton and Curtis Stevens climbed out of their vehicles with obvious reluctance, their body language suggesting they were having second thoughts about their involvement in Jake's increasingly obsessive mission. "Mrs. Sullivan," Jake called out as he approached the porch, his voice carrying a false politeness that didn't mask the underlying menace. "I think we need to have a conversation about some mutual friends of ours." Eleanor remained seated in her rocking chair, her hands gripping the armrests tightly. At 79, she had faced down charging bears and aggressive hunters during her field work years, and she wasn't about to be intimidated by a scarred man with obvious mental health issues. "I don't know what you're talking about, and I think you should leave my property immediately." Jake's laugh was harsh and devoid of humor. "Oh, I think you know exactly what I'm talking about. 3 red wolves that escaped from a sanctuary 6 months ago. 3 predators that have been killing livestock and terrorizing families across 2 states. 3 animals that you illegally harbored for 8 months before the federal government forced you to give them up." The detailed knowledge Jake displayed about her situation sent ice through Eleanor's veins. This wasn't a casual encounter with a concerned neighbor. This was a confrontation with someone who had been researching her background and tracking her activities. She could see the hunting rifles mounted in the gun racks of all three trucks, and the tactical gear that suggested Jake was prepared for far more than conversation. Even if I knew what you were talking about, which I don't, there's nothing I could tell you that would be helpful, Eleanor said, fighting to keep her voice steady. I'm an old woman who lives alone in the mountains. I don't have contact with any wild animals. Jake's expression hardened at her denial. Lady, I've been tracking those wolves for 3 months. Every kill site, every sighting, every piece of evidence points to them heading straight for these mountains. They're coming home to Mama, aren't they? The crude characterization of her relationship with the wolves stirred a protective anger that overrode Eleanor's fear. You don't know anything about those animals or what they mean to you, Jake interrupted, stepping closer to the porch. Let me tell you what they meant to my 8-year-old brother when a wolf tore his throat out 30 years ago. Let me tell you what they mean to the families who are going to lose children when your precious pets decide they're hungry for something more than deer. Eleanor's scientific training kicked in despite her emotional state. Red wolves are not aggressive toward humans. There has never been a documented case of a wild red wolf attacking a person. Your brother was killed by a wolf-dog hybrid, which is completely different. Don't you dare psychoanalyze me, you crazy old bat! Jake's composure cracked completely, revealing the decades of festering trauma beneath his hunter's facade. I know what I saw. I know what those things are capable of. And I know that when they show up here, I'm going to be waiting for them. Curtis Stevens stepped forward nervously. Jake, man, maybe we should just contact the wildlife officers. This is getting too intense. Jake whirled on his companion with fury that made both men take a step back. Those federal idiots have been looking for these wolves for 6 months and haven't found so much as a hair. They're bureaucrats playing catch-up while people's lives are at stake. We're going to handle this the right way. Eleanor realized with growing horror that Jake's plan involved far more than simply locating the wolves. You're planning to kill them. I'm planning to eliminate a threat to public safety, Jake corrected. 3 escaped predators that have already proven they can't be contained by human systems. When they come home to you, Mrs. Sullivan, they're going to find a reception committee that will solve this problem permanently. The casual certainty with which Jake discussed murdering her cubs triggered a protective rage that surprised Eleanor with its intensity. She stood up from her rocking chair with the dignity of a woman who had spent 40 years commanding respect in academic and professional settings. Get off my property. Now! Jake's response was to reach into his jacket and produce a large hunting knife that gleamed in the porch light. I don't think you understand the situation, Mrs. Sullivan. We're going to camp out on your land until those wolves show up. And you're going to help us by providing information about their habits, their preferred routes, and any signals you might use to communicate with them. I'll do no such thing. Yes, you will. Because if you don't cooperate, I might just decide that the person who created this whole mess is as dangerous as the animals she protected. Jake's scarred face twisted into an expression that made Eleanor's blood run cold. Old women living alone in the mountains have accidents all the time, falling downstairs, getting lost in the woods, surprising intruders who thought the house was empty. Billy Ray grabbed Jake's arm. Jesus Christ, Jake, you're talking about murdering an old lady. This isn't what we signed up for. Jake shook off his companion's grip with violent force. She's not some innocent old lady. She's a criminal who endangered an entire region by harboring illegal predators. She's the reason those wolves exist, to threaten families and children. Eleanor saw the madness in Jake's eyes and understood that rational argument was impossible. His brother's death had created a psychological wound that had festered for 30 years, transforming a tragic accident into a holy war against an entire species. Jake wasn't hunting wolves. He was trying to kill the trauma that had shaped his entire adult life. You need help, Eleanor said quietly. Professional help to deal with what happened to your brother. Killing innocent animals isn't going to bring him back or heal your pain. Jake's response was swift and brutal. The back of his hand caught Eleanor across the cheek with enough force to knock her off balance, sending her tumbling backward over her rocking chair. Her head struck the porch railing with a sickening crack, and warm blood began flowing from a gash above her left temple. Curtis Stevens stared in horror at the unconscious elderly woman bleeding on her own porch. "Jake, what the hell have you done? We need to call an ambulance." "We're not calling anyone," Jake snarled, wiping Eleanor's blood from his knuckles. "The old witch will be fine. A little knock on the head might help her remember where her priorities should be." Billy Ray knelt beside Eleanor's motionless form, checking for a pulse with shaking hands. "She's unconscious, man. This is assault on an elderly person. We could all go to prison for this." Jake surveyed the scene with the satisfaction of a man who felt justice had been served. She brought this on herself. When she wakes up, she'll understand that cooperation is her only option. We're going to set up camp in those woods and wait for her wolf friends to come home. And when they do, this whole nightmare is going to end. As Jake and his increasingly reluctant accomplices retreated to their vehicles to retrieve camping equipment, Eleanor lay unconscious on her porch, blood pooling beneath her gray hair. Above the mountains, storm clouds gathered with the promise of rain, and somewhere in the vast wilderness of the Appalachians, 3 wolves continued their 400-mile journey home to the only human who had ever shown them unconditional love. Eleanor regained consciousness 6 hours later to the sound of thunder rolling across the mountains and the metallic taste of blood in her mouth. Pain lanced through her skull as she struggled to sit up, her arthritic joints protesting against the hard wooden planks of the porch where she had been left to bleed. The gash above her temple had clotted, but dried blood matted her silver hair and stained her cardigan a rusty brown that looked black in the dim pre-dawn light. Her first coherent thought was not about her own injuries, but about the 3 pickup trucks she could see parked at various points around her property. Jake Morrison had made good on his threat to establish a hunting camp, and Eleanor could make out the orange glow of a campfire through the trees where he and his accomplices had positioned themselves to watch her cabin. The realization that armed men were waiting in her woods, planning to ambush her cubs if they returned, filled Eleanor with a terror more profound than any physical pain. Using the porch railing for support, Eleanor managed to pull herself upright and stumble into her cabin. The interior had been ransacked during her unconsciousness, drawers pulled open, papers scattered across the floor, her precious journals missing from their usual place on the bookshelf. Jake had taken her behavioral documentation, her maps of local wildlife trails, and 7 years of written observations about the cubs' habits and preferences. He now possessed the very information that could help him predict where Alpha, Luna, and Spirit would appear. Eleanor's hands trembled as she reached for the telephone, but her call to 911 revealed another layer of Jake's planning. The phone line had been cut, leaving her completely isolated on her 15-acre property with no way to contact the outside world. Her cell phone, an antiquated device that Sarah had forced her to carry for emergencies, showed no signal in the mountain valley where cell tower coverage had always been spotty at best. The deliberate nature of Jake's assault and the professional way he had isolated her from help suggested that this confrontation had been planned for weeks or even months. Eleanor realized with growing horror that Jake intended to use her as bait, keeping her trapped on the property until the wolves arrived, then forcing her to watch as he systematically murdered the animals she considered her children. Fighting through waves of nausea and disorientation from her head injury, Eleanor began searching her cabin for anything that might serve as a weapon or communication device. Her hunting rifle, a gift from Robert that she had kept for protection against bears and aggressive male deer during rutting season, was missing from its locked cabinet. Jake had been thorough in his preparation, eliminating any means Eleanor might have to defend herself or her wolves. As the sun rose over the mountains on what Eleanor feared might be her last day alive, she forced herself to eat a piece of toast and drink water, knowing that maintaining her strength was crucial for whatever confrontation lay ahead. Through her kitchen window she could see movement at Jake's campsite, the three men taking turns on watch duty, their rifles always within easy reach. The irony of her situation was not lost on Eleanor. After spending her entire career studying predator-prey relationships in the wild, she had become prey herself, hunted by a damaged man whose childhood trauma had metastasized into homicidal obsession. But unlike the animals she had studied, Eleanor possessed something her predator lacked: intimate knowledge of the wolves' behavior and the unshakable belief that they would recognize danger and respond accordingly. Eleanor's scientific mind began analyzing Jake's tactical errors. He had positioned his camp upwind from her cabin, meaning that any approaching wolves would scent him and his companions long before coming into rifle range. His use of artificial lights and the smell of his campfire would further alert animals that had spent 6 months surviving in the wilderness by avoiding human contact. Most critically, Jake's assumption that the wolves would approach Eleanor's cabin directly showed a fundamental misunderstanding of their intelligence and caution. As afternoon turned to evening, Eleanor resumed her position on the porch despite her injuries, playing her special whistle sequence into the gathering darkness. Jake's voice carried clearly across the distance between his camp and her cabin, shouting threats and demands that she stop calling those monsters, but Eleanor ignored him completely. If Alpha, Luna, and Spirit were within hearing distance, she wanted them to know she was here and waiting for them, regardless of the consequences. The breakthrough came just after midnight when Eleanor heard something that made her heart skip a beat. A distant howl echoing across the mountain valleys, answered immediately by 2 more voices harmonizing in the complex vocal patterns she remembered from the cub's adolescence. Jake heard it too, and Eleanor could see flashlight beams dancing frantically through the trees as he and his companions prepared their weapons and adjusted their positions. But the howling came from the wrong direction entirely. Instead of approaching from the main trail that led up to Eleanor's cabin, the wolves were communicating from the ridge above Jake's camp, nearly a mile away from where he had expected them to appear. Eleanor realized with a surge of pride that her cubs had not forgotten the lessons she had taught them about evaluating threats and approaching dangerous situations with extreme caution. Over the next hour, the howling continued sporadically, coming from different locations each time as the wolves circled Eleanor's property at a safe distance. Their vocalizations carried complex information that Eleanor's trained ear could partially interpret: pack position reports, threat assessments, and what sounded like coordinated movement patterns. Jake's increasingly frantic responses, shouting into the darkness and firing warning shots that echoed uselessly across empty forest, only confirmed to the wolves that the area around Eleanor's cabin was compromised. Eleanor began to understand that her cubs were not planning a reckless reunion driven by emotion. They were conducting a systematic reconnaissance mission, gathering information about the threats facing their surrogate mother before committing to any action. The wolves Jake dismissed as dumb animals were demonstrating tactical intelligence that would have impressed military strategists. The revelation of just how intelligent and careful the wolves had become filled Eleanor with conflicting emotions. She was proud of their survival skills and relieved that they were not walking blindly into Jake's trap. But she was also heartbroken by the realization that 7 years of separation and wilderness survival had transformed her trusting cubs into wary predators who could not risk approaching even her without extensive security protocols. As the hours passed and dawn approached for the second time since Eleanor's assault, Jake's frustration reached dangerous levels. His shouted threats became more graphic and personal, describing in disturbing detail what he planned to do to Eleanor if she continued interfering with the hunt. Billy Ray and Curtis's attempts to calm their increasingly unhinged leader were met with threats that suggested Jake's capacity for violence extended far beyond wolves and elderly women. Eleanor realized that Jake's deteriorating mental state represented a threat not just to her and the wolves, but potentially to anyone who crossed his path. His obsession with completing his self-appointed mission to eliminate the escaped wolves had consumed whatever rational thinking he might have once possessed. The scared 8-year-old boy who had watched his brother die had grown into a dangerous adult who saw threats everywhere and felt justified in using any means necessary to eliminate them. The morning of the third day brought unexpected salvation in the form of Marcus Rodriguez's routine patrol truck winding up Eleanor's driveway. The park ranger had been making extra visits since learning about the escaped wolves, checking on Eleanor's welfare and watching for any signs of unusual wildlife activity. His arrival at Jake's carefully orchestrated hunting camp created the kind of official witness that Jake could not simply eliminate or intimidate. Marcus took one look at Eleanor's injuries and the armed men camping in her woods before radioing for backup and federal wildlife enforcement officers. Jake's attempt to present himself as a concerned citizen conducting a public service was undermined by Eleanor's obvious assault injuries and the illegal modifications to his rifles that suggested he was hunting protected wildlife. As federal agents surrounded Jake's camp and placed all 3 men under arrest, Eleanor felt a mixture of relief and desperate urgency. The immediate threat to her safety had been eliminated, but somewhere in the mountains above her property, 3 wolves were still circling and waiting, unaware that it was now safe for them to come home. Eleanor struggled to her feet, ignoring Marcus's protests about her head injury, and walked to the center of her property. Raising her fingers to her lips, she played the special whistle sequence that had called her cubs home every evening for 8 months, 7 years ago. The sound echoed across the mountain valleys with the clarity of crystal, carrying her love and longing across the miles to 3 hearts that had never forgotten the woman who saved their lives. The answer came immediately. 3 distinct howls from the ridge above, closer now than they had been all night, filled with the unmistakable joy of recognition. The reunion began as 3 shadows moving through the morning mist, descending the mountain slope with the fluid grace of apex predators who had survived 6 months in the wilderness. Eleanor watched from her porch, her heart hammering against her ribs as Alpha emerged first from the tree line. No longer the playful cub she remembered, but a magnificent 100-pound male whose amber eyes held the wisdom of survival and the unmistakable recognition of home. Luna followed, her silver-tipped coat gleaming in the early sunlight, moving with the careful precision of an animal who had learned to trust nothing completely. Spirit brought up the rear, smaller than her siblings, but carrying herself with the quiet confidence of a wolf who had never forgotten the human scent that meant safety and unconditional love. Eleanor couldn't speak. 7 years of grief, hope, and longing crystallized into this impossible moment as Alpha approached the porch steps with cautious dignity. His massive head tilted slightly at the sight of her injuries, a soft whine escaping his throat that sounded heartbreakingly like the questioning sounds he had made as a confused cub. Eleanor extended her trembling hand, and Alpha pressed his forehead against her palm with the gentleness of an animal who remembered being bottle-fed by these same fingers. "My babies," Eleanor whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You came home to me." Luna approached next, her intelligent eyes scanning Eleanor's face with concern before nuzzling against her injured temple with delicate precision, as if trying to heal the wounds with maternal care. Spirit, true to her name, seemed to materialize beside Eleanor's chair without making a sound, pressing her warm body against the elderly woman's legs in the same gesture of comfort she had offered as a puppy. Marcus Rodriguez watched from a respectful distance, his radio turned low to avoid startling the wolves, but Eleanor could see him recording everything on his phone. This moment would need to be documented, would need to serve as evidence for the complex legal and conservation discussions that would inevitably follow. Dr. Patricia Hawkins arrived within the hour, summoned by Marcus's call and carrying a veterinary kit that would allow her to examine the wolves for injuries or illness. The reunion had drawn a small crowd of federal wildlife officers, conservation officials, and local law enforcement, but the wolves seemed unfazed by the human presence, focused entirely on their elderly surrogate mother. "Eleanor, they're magnificent," Patricia breathed, watching Alpha demonstrate the complex hand signals Eleanor had taught him as a cub. "Look at their condition. They're not just surviving, they're thriving. Their coat quality, muscle tone, alertness levels, these are healthy, well-adapted animals." Dr. Thomas Whitfield arrived from North Carolina that afternoon, accompanied by a team of wildlife biologists who wanted to document the unprecedented reunion between a human caregiver and escaped red wolves. His examination revealed that all three wolves were in excellent health, showing no signs of malnutrition or stress-related illness despite their long journey home. "Mrs. Sullivan, what we're witnessing here is extraordinary," Dr. Whitfield explained, as Luna submitted to his examination with remarkable trust. "These wolves have retained their human socialization while developing the survival skills necessary for life in the wild. They represent a unique bridge between captive breeding programs and wild reintroduction efforts." The solution that emerged from the complex negotiations that followed would have seemed impossible just days earlier. Eleanor's property would be expanded through federal partnership to create a private sanctuary where Alpha, Luna, and Spirit could live in semi-wild conditions while contributing to red wolf conservation research. Eleanor would become the sanctuary's official caretaker, her decades of experience and unique bond with the wolves making her irreplaceable to the program. Sarah arrived from California that evening, her initial fear giving way to amazement as she watched her 79-year-old mother demonstrate the remarkable communication system she had developed with three of the most endangered predators in North America. "Mom, this isn't just a reunion," Sarah said quietly. "This is a miracle." As the sun set over the Appalachian Mountains, Eleanor sat on her porch surrounded by the three wolves who had traveled 400 miles to find their way home to her heart. Alpha rested his massive head in her lap while Luna and Spirit flanked her chair like living guardians. The special whistle sequence that had called them home echoed one more time across the valley, but now it was answered not by distant howls from the wilderness, but by the contented huffing sounds of families settling in for the night. Jake Morrison, facing federal charges for assault and illegal wildlife harassment, would eventually receive the psychological help he needed to process his childhood trauma. Billy Ray and Curtis, granted immunity for their cooperation, would become advocates for wildlife conservation and responsible hunting practices. Eleanor Sullivan, at 79 years old, had proven that love truly knows no boundaries, that family bonds can survive any separation, and that sometimes the greatest conservation victories happen not in government offices or research facilities, but in the simple act of opening one's heart to creatures in need. The wolves had come home, and for the first time in 7 years, Eleanor's house was no longer empty. At 79, Eleanor Sullivan discovered that the greatest love stories aren't always between people. Sometimes they're between a lonely heart and 4 tiny creatures who needed saving. When she found those orphaned wolf cubs 7 years ago, Eleanor was just a grieving widow trying to fill the emptiness left by her husband's death. She never imagined that bottle feeding those babies would create bonds so powerful that they would travel 400 miles through wilderness to find their way back to her arms. Through heartbreak, separation, and even violent threats from those who didn't understand, Eleanor's love never wavered. And when Alpha, Luna, and Spirit finally emerged from the mountain mist to reunite with their human mother, they proved that family isn't defined by blood or species. It's defined by the courage to love unconditionally. Eleanor's story reminds us that our most meaningful relationships often come when we least expect them, and that opening our hearts to creatures in need can fill spaces we didn't even know were empty. Sometimes the love that saves us comes on four paws, with amber eyes full of trust, and hearts that never forget the hands that once fed them when the world seemed impossibly dark. Share with us. Have you ever experienced an unexpected bond with an animal that changed your life? What moment in your own life reminded you that love can come from the most surprising places? Tell us your story in the comments below.